Yeah, the biotech sector in building companies is quite unique. In a way, especially if you develop drugs, you have a very high capital need. You have to raise potentially more than tens of millions of funding before you even come to a value inflection point that you can either sell or license a product or potentially then sell the whole company. This is quite different from other industry sectors, like, for example, IT or software engineering or fintech or developing certain apps. I think this goes much faster. It needs much less capital expenditure in terms of expensive and complicated laboratory infrastructure. But biotech in general is very expensive, needs a lot of capital in order to develop first prototypes or certain drugs or to validate certain concepts. And then also the time frames are very long because very often you need to validate your innovation not only in a culture dish or in an animal model, but if you really want to create value, you have to show that your innovation ideally works in patients and in human beings. If you develop human drugs, you have to go through clinical trials. You have very high standards in manufacturing your drug candidates under highest standards. You have to do extensive studies to test your molecule preclinically, also in terms of safety, with very expensive toxicology models. And this is quite special in biotech and quite different from other high-tech industries where, you need much less capital requirements and much less expensive infrastructure. In the mid-90s, end of 90s, there were many technologies developed after people have realized that monoclonal antibodies could be very useful drugs for treating various diseases, either autoimmune diseases by blocking certain growth factors or inflammatory factors that lead to autoimmunity, but also potentially blocking pathways that can lead to cancer. But at the time when monoclonal antibody technology came along, the pharma industry was mostly focused on developing small molecule drugs based on chemistry. So monoclonal antibodies were biologics and a class of molecules that were not so well understood in the early days, potentially, and also they were still a challenge to manufacture them cost effectively. It was not clear whether monoclonal antibodies in these early days, in the mid-90s and 90s, would be so successful as they are currently. So monoclonal antibodies are the most successful class of biological drugs, generating more than 230 billion revenues per year for various pharma companies today. So the key in making these monoclonal antibodies successful for clinical use was to actually make them compatible with the human immune system. So for this, the antibodies have to be humanized or they have to be fully human. So in the early days, this was done by genetic engineering using certain bacterial phage expression systems. So these were companies like Cambridge Antibody Technologies, MorphoSys, who pioneered these technologies. And then there were other technologies developed by companies like Agenus or Medarex that created so-called transgenic animals that harbored the human genes for human antibodies in the genome of the mice. So when these mice were immunized or vaccinated, they actually didn't produce mouse antibodies, but they produced human antibodies. And these could be used to create these human antibodies for therapeutic use. So we have been doing research for tens of years, and my PhD thesis was entirely focused on the study of how B cells are being generated and how they develop in the immune system. So we actually then thought about the technology after several years, how we could use directly the B cells from a mouse in tissue culture without having actually a mouse in your hand to create by genetic engineering fully human antibodies. And this was the starting technology that we used at 4Antibody. And this was successfully used to create, well, a dozen of therapeutic antibody candidates. But in the time that we developed the technology in the first company, we didn't make it to the point that we developed these antibodies clinically. There was a lot of money required for this, and the company already developed the technology for several years. So we only had a portfolio of preclinical monoclonal antibodies that we developed. And the company that acquired us, US-based Agenus, they are actually now in pivotal commercialization trials to finally bring these antibody candidates to the market. And these monoclonal antibodies are so-called checkpoint inhibitor antibodies. So what they do is they interfere with the mechanism how the cancer suppresses the immune system so that the cancer is not attacked by the immune system. So when an antibody interferes with this checkpoint, so it's called checkpoint inhibitor, then the immune system all of a sudden recognizes the tumor again and can fight it. These days, they're the most successful antibody products, generating billions of dollars of revenues for the pharma companies. But at the time when we worked on this, it was a concept that was not very validated. And we sold the company then, before we could validate this concept clinically ourselves. NBE Therapeutics was a very special case because it was my second company that I started after the first company was sold to US-based Agenus. And it was not a spin-off from the university or from any academic research group. So here I could really leverage the experience and the network that I had built with my first company in terms of knowing certain investors, knowing certain business partners, but also knowing the field and the industry. And after I've been developing antibody molecules or antibody drugs preclinically in the first company, I knew that at this point of time in 2012, when I started NBE Therapeutics, there was a market need in making antibody drugs more efficient. And there was one strategy that was, up and coming during these days. And these were the so-called antibody drug conjugates. So where you couple or conjugate toxic chemicals to antibodies in order to bring them specifically to tumor cells. So in a way, this magic bullet, this antibody drug conjugate is like a cruise missile that has a guiding device that guides the missile to its target and has a warhead that is able to destroy the target. So this is exactly the concept of an antibody drug conjugate. The two molecules, Kadcyla and Azetris, that came to the market in 2011 and 2012 and were the first antibody drug conjugates that seemed to work in patients, were still not perfect molecules. They were created by chemically coupling toxic molecules to the antibodies in a way that is not very precise. For example, the Roche product Kadcyla, there were over 90 different molecules in the mixture of this antibody drug conjugates, all with different properties in terms of safety and efficacy. Although the product itself worked better than the naked antibody that was used for treating cancer patients, it was still not the ideal way to make these antibody drug conjugates. So I had the idea to use a specific enzyme that can put a chemical molecule to an antibody in a defined position and make it completely homogeneous so that you only have one molecule in your drug instead of more than 90 or a mixture of 90 with different properties. The idea was that we get a better molecule with defined properties and better properties in terms of safety and efficacy in the patients. The sortase enzyme has been known for more than 20 years, but it has never been used in the context of making antibody drug conjugates. And this is where I took some knowledge from my academic research dating many, many years back and combining that with kind of the knowledge of antibody technologies that I've gained during my first company for antibody, but now creating a next generation of modified or improved antibodies for cancer therapy. A patent application was written on that concept, not even putting any scientific or let's say experimental data into this patent application. So it was a real concept and a totally new idea of creating next generation antibody drug conjugates with an enzymatic conjugation approach. This was the starting point for NBE Therapeutics. So now you could think, well, is that enough to build a company? Probably not. But it was kind of a starting point because, well, there are two other things that are important for, well, developing a novel drug, which is not only a technology that you can use and that you can create a proof of concept for, but of course, we also, and this is the knowledge that went back through my last 10 years in starting my first company, we knew a lot of interesting targets for cancer patients that have not been explored for antibody drug conjugates. So it was a combination of, we went into novel targets addressing certain tumors where there was an unmet medical need, and we had a technology platform not yet reduced to practice, but according to what was known in the field academically, it should work. We actually raised then a small amount of money for NBE Therapeutics with seed investors, initially a group of private individuals who chipped in the first $500,000, but then soon afterwards, the first corporate venture came along, which was the Boehringer Ingelheim Venture Fund, and invested the first $1 million. And this is what we used to validate our technology platform, create a proof of concept that this conjugation technology indeed provides better and fully homogeneous products, where we claimed that they would be superior to the randomly and chemically conjugated products that were currently out there. We first had to experimentally prove that this could work. And for this, we built a very basic lab infrastructure where we made the first tests. We ordered the enzyme, we ordered antibodies. We actually then tested with our own hands. And I still remember we were two people in the company, myself and my chief scientific officer, Roger Berli. And it actually worked quite well. It worked to an efficiency that gave us products that were really of a much higher quality of what we had in our hands when we looked at the molecules, Kadcyla and Adcetris, which were currently on the market and used for human patients, for human cancer patients. At that time, we didn't even have a name for this technology, but we were looking for a very nifty name. And I think this is also important, that maybe at some point of time you have a good name for your product and your innovation, because otherwise nobody can remember it. So we called our technology SMAC technology. This was an acronym for sortase-mediated antibody conjugation. And SMAC is a little bit like SmackDown, or kind of, it has a good sound, I think. But it took us a train ride to one of our investors where we said, we have to come up with a name for this. And in this train ride, we actually then came up with a name. Why don't we call it SMAC technology, SMAC? And we actually then looked on the web whether there is actually already a name like this out there, a trade name or something that, could jeopardize that we use this name, but there wasn't anything out there. So we trademarked that name very quickly afterwards. And this was kind of the basis for starting NBE Therapeutics. So we could convince early investors that with these improved properties and the homogeneity of this product, and most importantly, a very stable connection of the toxic payload to the antibody, that this would improve the safety of these products. Because the chemically conjugated antibody drug conjugates that were on the market were known to very quickly lose their payload and actually use the typical side effects of chemotherapy, where you randomly distribute the toxic substance in your body. You want to really have it tightly coupled to the antibody and precisely delivered to the site of the tumor. So this is what we claimed we can achieve with our new technology and with our enzymatic conjugation. But of course, that had to be proven clinically. And this is where then, of course, much larger funds needed to be raised and to be deployed. The first company, when it was then sold to US-based Agenus, had actually labs and offices in the Technology Park Basel, which was an incubator startup facility. So when I had the idea for the second company after the trade sale of the first company, I simply rented an office and a lab also in the Technology Park to start my second company. Again, I experienced a lot of support from other startup companies in this incubator facility, in particular the company Bioversus, which I think is well known here in the Basel area and developing drugs against antibiotic resistance. So they gave me a corner in their lab that we could do the first pipetting experiments before we even had any funds raised, and just a little bit money to buy the first pipettes and the first equipment. So it was, again, the support of somebody unexpected and somebody else, a totally unrelated company who said, well, these poor guys don't even have a good lab infrastructure. You can have a corner in our lab, and there you can make the first pipetting experiments, where we showed that this technology can potentially work. But then, of course, as looking for funds, then you have to, well, write a business plan, or at least an outline of a business plan. You have to create investors' presentations. I very early on, got Roger Berli, my chief scientific officer, interested in that project. He was not a co-founder, but really was one of the scientific experts who joined the NBE Therapeutics very early on and stayed until its exit. We were a very small team at the beginning with only 3 or 4 team members, some of them still being part-time in academia and then slowly moving over to the company when we raised the first funds from investors and then the first corporate venture. I mean, initially, of course, when you have little funding available, at least in Switzerland, there is the possibility to make collaborations with academic groups and to get some funding for these academic groups. In the early days of NBE, we have really applied for a lot of CTI grants, or nowadays InnoSwiss grants, and we had 2 or 3. So the funding goes to the academic research group, but there is a contract that is entered between the academic research group and the company, that the commercialization of the results that come out of this collaboration vests with the commercial partner. And I think this is an excellent instrument that Switzerland has installed in order to support companies not directly, but rather indirectly via academic partners. And the academic partners, of course, have the infrastructure, the laboratory infrastructure, so that the experiments can start right away. We had these collaborations, but we also had a collaboration with other granting schemes with the University of Basel, with the ETH Institute, and they all helped us to lay the technical foundation in the early days when we still had to build our own laboratory infrastructure. So this is quite special in Switzerland to have these instruments where the companies can leverage the infrastructure and the know-how of academic research groups in order to validate the concepts that are then being commercialized in the companies. Venture Kick, of course, is a very important instrument for academic spin-offs. Of course, if you are not an academic spin-off, like with my second company, I was not eligible for any Venture Kick program because it is really specific for spin-outs from academic institutions, be it ETH, the technical universities, or the universities in Switzerland. But if it's the first startup company, Venture Kick is a fantastic initiative and instrument not only to fund new spin-offs coming from these academic institutions, but also to give them the first basic business training and to also refine their concepts by listening to some mentors and experts who are part of the Venture Kick jury and organization that selects at the end the projects that will receive funding. So whenever I have time, I try to participate in this program, to select and then to support promising spin-offs from the universities. But if you start outside of an academic institution, venture kick is not an instrument. But still, if you start outside of an academia, you can still access the academic infrastructure via InnoSwiss, doing bilateral collaborations with academic research groups for the benefit of the companies, because then they will work on a project that, of course, is then formulated by the biotech company or the commercial partner. In terms of personal risk, yes, you risk your reputation. You risk that the company might fail. But I think this is the fundamental difference that you often see between European entrepreneurs and US-based entrepreneurs, that actually in the United States, it's being highly regarded if you start something and you fail, because then you learn something and you do it again. In Europe, often it's seen a little bit as a negative if your first endeavor, your first company fails, and the hurdle is much higher to make a second attempt. I think we still have to learn a little bit from the US attitude, the just do it attitude. And well, if you don't fail, then you haven't learned anything. If you fall down, you have to get up again and try it a second time, and maybe a third time. I've even heard once a US-based investor who said, well, I'm not investing in a person who hasn't failed a company at least once. He also said, of course, if you fail 3 times, that's a little bit too much. Then 3 strikes and you're out. But I mean, failing at least once, I think, is not something that should stop you from starting a second time and to follow your vision and your dreams and to create companies and to follow your visions. It's always a roller coaster ride. I mean, you have, of course, phases where things work out very well, where you are successful. But then inevitably, there will be phases where, I mean, you face challenges where a certain result or some kind of adverse event happens. And this could be even something globally, economically, that works against you. So we have seen various financial crises in the last 20 years. So if you're trying to raise funds during these times, you will face challenges. But it could also be, of course, company internal things that turn things to the worse. And so therefore you have to actually deal with crises quite often as an entrepreneur, and if you're a startup CEO, and you need to be prepared that there will be crises in the development of a company. In my view, you need to remain calm, and you need to always find the best solution for these crisis situations or the challenges that are coming. In my experience, I have to say the best innovations or the best solutions always came up in situations where the company was under extreme pressure, which could mean that there was, kind of a shortcoming in financing, or that a certain technology has not worked as we had thought, and we needed to find a solution, and we needed to find it very quickly. It's almost this do or die situation where I think the best things come out if you remain calm in the situation and try to find the best solution. There's certainly one example from my first company, for antibody, where the antibody discovery technology that the company started with actually hit some technical difficulties where it was not clear whether it would work at least as efficiently as we had hoped for. The pressure was on that with the original technology platform, the investors were hesitant to continue to finance the company. And we were kind of in a situation where, we were under financial distress. Of course, in this situation, I mean, you try to save as much money as possible. And unfortunately, we had 1 or 2 people that we needed to let go. And I think without this pressure of really staying with the back against the wall, or standing with the back against the wall, we would not have had this enormous pressure to entirely go back to the drawing board and design an alternative technology platform still employing elements of our original approach, but we designed a completely novel technology platform for which we filed novel patent applications, which eventually, was the platform that was the workhorse for all of our antibody discovery technologies in the coming years, and is kind of the technology that is now being used by the company which acquired us. And we managed, but we only managed because, well, we had to. And I think without this, without being outside of your comfort zone, I believe it's very difficult to do completely novel innovation or some disruptive thinking, what people always refer to thinking outside of the box. So I think this is a learning that is a theme that I had in other companies as well. Whenever things got really difficult, this is when the most creative moments happened. There's always a starting point, which is not quite perfect yet. And then there's this element where, you make a planning on a particular product, in an innovation, a technology that you have. So you make your planning, the best case, medium case, worst case. But very often you have to do innovation on the way, that you cannot plan ahead at the beginning. And therefore, one has to be prepared to go into the unknown, and you have to be opportunistic in situations where you need to find solutions, to look for them or to develop them yourself. And as I said, under situations of extreme pressure, this works more efficiently according to my experience. Yeah, sometimes as a founder and chief executive officer of a startup company, I always call myself a chief motivation officer. I think there's a little bit of an inherent optimism that you have to have as an entrepreneur. So in a sense that you believe there's always a solution. If there's a challenge, there's a solution. Actually, I never talk about problems. There are only challenges and not problems. I think if there's a challenge, you have to find out, how can we address this challenge adequately? This, of course, also means that with a calm head, you look at the fundamental aspects of the challenge. And I think this is the essence of entrepreneurship, that you cannot plan everything ahead of time or in advance, that you have to be prepared for challenges and for failures. And when they occur, you have to, analyze what is the reason for this and how can you solve these challenges or overcome the failures if they happened. I think if you want to be successful as an entrepreneur, you can never do it without a team. And in order to have an effective team, you really have to take them on board. You have to be brutally honest with them. Also, in times when things are not going according to plan, and if things are not going well, one should never tell any false stories to your team members, because then you will lose all credibility. I've always pursued my idea of being transparent, of keeping everyone who joins my journey in building a company fully informed about where we are, what are the difficulties, what are the shortcomings, what are the challenges, because you want to be credible and you want to be authentic. And you don't want to tell stories that are fake, because people will very quickly see through this. They will quickly realize that you're building up a story that is not true, and also you're not sleeping well if you're telling stories and you think, gee, this was really not very good. Tomorrow I have to revise it. So I think one always has to be truthful. One has to be transparent. One has to tell people who join you on the journey what they are in. And then you actually, have a team that, is going to the same direction, a team that you can rely on, a team that trusts you, and a team that you can trust. And I think this trust and transparency and truthfulness is an essential ingredient for building a successful company. I've always told everyone in the company, what challenges are in front of us, what hurdles are in front of us, and that we will manage this together if we are giving our best. But I'm also telling people if things get ugly and if, let's say, something is not going according to plan, people will see it anyway. But I mean, it's always good to keep people brutally informed about the truth. So my first company, we had 3 co-founders. In the last company, we have 3 co-founders. NBE, I founded indeed with 2 very, let's say, already investors. So they kind of co-founded the company by just providing the funds. So if I count them, it's also 3. So it looks like 3 is the magic number here. In a team of founders, it's very beneficial to have different characters, to have different experiences, complementary expertise. It is good actually to have a longer term relationship between the founders, because then you know each other better. I mean, there's an element of friendship that has built, or maybe you are good colleagues for a long period of time. It has the danger, if things go wrong, that friendships can go apart. But I've always been able to separate kind of the friendship part from kind of the business part, although sometimes it may not be possible. I mean, there's a certain danger that, I mean, if you create an unsuccessful business and the investment of time and money of your partners goes down the drain, that you will not remain friends. And you have to be, well, aware of the fact that this is an acute danger. But nevertheless, I believe it is a better basis if you know each other a little bit longer than just half a year when you found a company. That is point number 1. I think this is something that I would advocate is a better starting point than having just random people. But of course, the complementary expertise and in a little way, maybe also complementary characters are beneficial because, well, then there's always a little bit of a tension. Not everyone is kind of immediately of the same opinion. I think it's maybe a little bit like having a music band. So you have to have someone who plays the piano, another one who plays the guitar, another one who plays the bass, and some who plays the drums, and then you have a lead singer. And this analogy is maybe not so wrong, because what also happens is that in a team of co-founders, and this has been my experience myself, but also with a lot of startup companies that I've seen, it looks like there's always mostly one person, sometimes there can be 2, but 1 or 2 persons who really take a lead in building up the company and putting the substantial effort in, or bringing most of the innovation to the table, simply most of the energy, time, commitment. And therefore, I think very early on, before starting a company and saying, well, each of the founders, we are all equal and everyone gets a third in the company, one should really be realistic and have a discussion about, well, who is putting in what, how much commitment is being devoted by each of the founders, and how this should be reflected in the shareholdings of the original founders' shares when the company is created. That actually is already the first test of the partnership, whether you can come to a decision, or let's say a reasonable decision there, and a compromise, or whether you already see that somebody says, no, we are 3, everyone gets 1/3, and it doesn't matter who puts in as how much commitment or investment and so on and so forth. So I would say one should absolutely, well, start a company before going out to investors, because it clarifies, well, who has how much stake in the company from the founders team, and who is actually leading the team. So who is the lead singer of the band? There has to be one lead singer, because this is the person, this is then the CEO of the company, or the startup CEO of the company, who should not dominate the other team members and the co-founders, but probably is the person who has the highest credibility, or is most convincing, or is the person who can convince others and other stakeholders most efficiently in embarking on a journey. I would say it has to be the person who can really manage the expectations of many stakeholders, can build teams, can communicate well. So that needs to be figured out very early on, because I've seen founding teams breaking apart when initially everyone was happy with the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And then a year into the project, it was clear that one was doing 80% of the work and the others maybe each 10%, or maybe one 15 and the other one 5%. And still the distribution was 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And this is something that is really not working in the long run because it's an unfair representation of the commitments and the effort that is being put in. I wanted to mention this because I've seen many projects fail because there was then this point where people could not agree on a reasonable distribution of the founder's equity in the company. And also investors will realize who is actually the lead singer in the band. And they don't like to see an equal distribution of the equity because they, well, of course, invest in, well, a team, yes, but they also invest in a person who they believe can bring the project forward. And if they see that there is a disconnect between what people are committing and putting into the company and the equity stake in, early on in the company, the investors will also not be happy and also early on try to make the adjustments. This is why certain founders may then hate the investors, but I mean, they know out of experience that if there's a disbalance between what is realistically taking place and how the equity is being distributed, this is not a good recipe for building a company successfully. So this is among the founders. So be open to adjust the equity when it comes to founding the company to what is really the investment of each co-founder in the company. And there one has to actually be able to make compromises. I think it's not good if you have a 95, if there's a founders team and you have a 95 and 2.5 and 2.5%, because that clearly signals and shows that this is a one man or one woman show and the others are just decoration. A co-founder should always have at least 10% in the equity. I mean, if it's 3, I think it should be at least 20%. So there shouldn't be kind of a distribution where, I mean, there's a huge disbalance between the 3 founders, because then again, it's not a functioning team. So a little bit more of a balanced distribution of the founders' equity is desired, but of course it has to reflect. If really someone is pulling this through, I mean, a 60-20-20 can be absolutely acceptable, but if it was a 40-30-30, I mean, this is all variations from. But I would not go over 80% for a single co-founder. I think this is something where then the others are really not feeling important enough. But if, let's say, there is one founder and there's this magic 25% limit, if 2 of the founders are above the 25% limit, then they have a significant stake in the company and potentially a blocking right if there's a simple shareholders agreement, so that not one person can dominate the others entirely, so that you always need to have a compromise. And actually that theme of having a balance in equity, I think is a good one, even in later financing rounds. Also, I think it doesn't make sense if either investors are underrepresented or hugely overrepresented, because then again, it's one stakeholder who controls everything. And this is, I think, not good for giving not only the feeling to the team, but really living that the team is going to the same direction, and everyone's involvement makes a difference and is accordingly also rewarded.